Hi, folks, and thanks for joining us here at SomeFuture for episode 29 of our podcast. We're your hosts, Jack and Chris.
Hey.
What's up, man?
What's up?
So for today's episode, we have for Present Futures, we will be discussing the establishment of a U.S. Space Force and Cyber Force and the power of the mind. No, really, the power it has to do other things besides think. We also have a new segment that we will be doing today called Weird Futures. We still plan on talking about neat ideas, both past and present, but we will be focusing on a technology framework or theory that we think would be great to focus on. And on FizBiz, we will be discussing big data and data manipulation. As always, we hope that you enjoy our show, and please visit our website and blog where we post our supporting materials at www.somefuture.org. Follow us on our Twitter handle at SomeFuture, or visit us on our Facebook page, or simply connect with us on LinkedIn or Facebook. We always welcome your engagement with questions, concerns, or ideas of things you would like to hear about on our podcast by emailing us at somefuturepodcast@gmail.com or by engaging with us on social media. Now let's see what the future has in store for us in SomeFuture.
That's SomeFuture.
Okay, so for my present futures, I wanted to talk about the establishment of the Space Force that President Trump was talking about.
Space Force.
A lot recently.
Space Force.
Yes. Star Wars. No. But I also wanted to talk about another important subject, which was a cyber force, which was brought up quite often. People were discussing this new establishment of a Space Force. So President Trump in 2018 passed an executive order setting the foundation for a Space Force and tasking the Joint Chief of Staff to organize the beginnings of establishing this sixth branch of our military, and he coined the phrase Space Force. On August 13th of 2018, he signed into law the John S. McCain National Defense Authorization, which laid out the reestablishment of a United Space Command led by a four-star general or admiral and will be temporarily under U.S. strategic command until it becomes its own force. The Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson, who was originally opposed to the establishment of a Space Force, stated her full support recently in September. She wants to do it correctly, and it won't be done with any half measures. She projects that it would actually have only about 13,000 members at first and a budget of about $14 billion, which obviously, in U.S. military speak, that's not a lot. But the idea of the Space Force and the idea of them rolling this in there is that just like the Marines are part of the Navy, so too they think that the Space Force will become a part of the U.S. Air Force. But I'm bringing this up specifically because I think while the establishment of a Space Force is important for the future, I think that we also need to build a cyber force, and we need to do it now. Just like these two departments will have forces reporting to them, I believe that, if we establish a cyber force, why not put it under the Department of the Army? Because now we have the Marines under the Navy, we could have the Space Force on the Air Force, and we could have a cyber force underneath the Army. I think that makes really a lot of sense. I think, and Chris, I'm going to get your input on this in a second, but I think that we need a cyber force because I think it's just as important as a Space Force. There's a greater necessity for focus on a different, unique zone of operations, which is cyberspace. Military activity in the cyber realm is currently a pickup game, with each of the services offering a small cadre of cyber warriors on a temporary basis to the Pentagon's newest combatant command, U.S. Cyber Command. Its leader, General Paul Nakasone, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, and his predecessors, they've done a good job of marshaling these individual service contributions, but it's a cumbersome process, and those assigned to the command usually return to their parent service after their tour of duty at the National Security Agency headquarters in Maryland. Not only do the same arguments for a Space Force apply in cyber, but the threats we face there are currently larger. The digital world is already highly militarized. The size of a cyber force would be tiny compared to the vast bureaucracies of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the individual armed forces do not have adequate incentives to pay attention to this job. They're very busy training equipment and organizing their force to do the traditional warfighting tasks, such as the land, the sea, and the air. And we have to look at it this way, that China and Russia have huge offensive cyber capabilities. We've watched Russia use these tools in attacking the country of Georgia in 2008. Which will go down in military history as the first nation attacked, not only kinetically, but simultaneously in cyber. And then we have Ukraine, where they paralyzed part of the electric grid. Other nations, notably Iran and North Korea, also have a significant offensive cyber capability as well. Obviously, about North Korea's hacking of Sony Pictures in 2014, which was, they did that to an American corporation that made a film called The Interview that mocked the dictator Kim Jong-un. Iran has made several forays against the U.S. in cyberspace, including attacks on utilities, and was behind the large-scale attack on Saudi Aramco in 2012, forcing the world's largest oil company to shut down its internal computer network. We also realize that there is a very real threat to our way of life and democracy, even, as it's been proven Russia meddled with some success in our most recent presidential election and is continuing to target the United States and our allies with misinformation campaigns. The target market for how large this force would be if we built a cyber force would only be about 5,000 or 10,000 people. That's all we would really need to be able to protect our companies and our citizens from attacks from outside actors. Obviously, then I'll go into Space Force, and then, like I said, I'm gonna get your input on what you think of both of these, Chris. So either way, I don't care if you agree or disagree, and I'm talking to our audience. I don't care if you agree or disagree with our president. The establishment of a Space Force is crucial, actually, for the safety and security of our country. We need a Space Force because we will be safer with true specialists who are completely focused on this important zone of operations. They will combine the various service space bureaucracies into one branch, which would create a streamlined single point of focus, likely saving manpower and money. And space does deserve its own strategy, especially given the competition and real threats, like I said, from Russia and China, who are also heavily investing in this space, not only cyber, but they're investing in space. And just some of the things that a Space Force would do. I'm not going to get into the specifics. You can look all of this stuff up. But if you have to think about it this way, a Space Force would protect our GPS capabilities. It would protect us from asteroids and space debris. Think about it this way. They would maybe build specific devices to combat a very real threat from outer space, asteroid hitting the planet. Also, the idea of what we covered in our last episode about space debris. It's really important to do something about that. Think about it this way, too, is rescuing civilians in space. Obviously, you've got SpaceX and other companies now launching civilian missions into outer space. Well, if something happens, which it very well could, there's no one up there to save those people if something goes wrong. There's logistics, being able to deliver information, personnel, and vehicles quickly around the world. If you had a Space Force, it could do that by launching from the atmosphere into any region in very quickly. There's surveillance and I think that being able to see and hear things around the world and be able to do it quickly and efficiently would be good. Orbital strikes, that's a little bit farther in the future, but think about lasers and missiles from space to enemy targets on the planet. China's actually, in the earlier part of the century, showed that they have the capability to target our satellites from the ground. So having a force to protect these is imperative. In 2006, they destroyed a satellite from their base of operations. A couple more quick things. Space law enforcement. As we continue to build colonies, we will need to figure out some way to enforce our rules and policies, protecting trade and travel routes when those colonies are built. And I know that it seems far-fetched right now, the idea of space colonies, but I'm not thinking of like Alpha Centauri. I'm thinking about Mars and the Moon. NASA said they wanted to establish a permanent base by the 2020s on the Moon. China's trying to build a permanent base. I think that those are all really important things. So, Chris, I want to bring you in on this. You're somebody who has served in our U.S. Armed Forces as a member of our Air Force. I mean, what do you think about all of this? Give us your insights.
Sure. So, one, I don't necessarily have a problem with it, right? I don't think it's really that big of a deal because we already have a Space Force. The Space Force already exists. It's called the United States Space Command. It's existed since 1985. It leads things that you just mentioned: satellite communications, space intelligence, space navigation systems, space missile warning systems, space weather systems, and I'm assuming like that its mission would just expand even if we didn't have a Space Force, which would continue in, these sorts of actions. So it was established in 1985, and it sort of coordinated all of space operations for the Army and the Navy and the Air Force. So in some ways, the establishment of the Space Force is really just taking this group of folks and just putting them here and giving them a different uniform or, whatever, which is fine. And keep in mind, we've done this before in, with our military. in the 1940s, and you would know this too, right? Because your grandfather was in the Army Air Corps. So the Army used to be a part of our armed forces, or used to be a part of the Air Force. The Air Force used to be a part of the Army, and then it was split up into where we have a defense force that flies in the air and takes care of stuff above the ground, and whereas the Army's essentially on the ground. So we've done this before, and essentially what it is it's a sort of a mechanism for disbursement of funds, which I think that makes a lot of sense, right? To make sure that you have funds that are obligated for certain parts of space, which are extremely important. So in some ways, none of this necessarily bothers me because it's not something that's completely going to change how our space operations works already, because there's already this sort of stuff in works. And then even some of the things that you're talking on, that's not going to come for many years in the future. So, this is a sort of good initial step. We didn't have the SR-71 in 1947 when the Air Force was established. We didn't have the F-16, the F-15. We didn't have Space Command and space capabilities at that time. But what that did is it set up a mechanism for disbursement of funds, for separation of sort of mission, and leading in vision, and of course the personnel that it takes, and all the testing and all the stuff that makes the military run. So I'm okay with this. I think it's fine. What I'm always hesitant about is the investment in an additional piece of or military expenditures for the United States, but really for all countries. I want to ensure that there is some sort of cautious investment in this sort of work. Do know that military expenditures are maybe might be excessive in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
And we need to ensure that these funds that we're investing in this new Space Force, which would mean probably more money going into our military, because space is expensive. It would take it's. So I just think we need to, like anything we do with the government, pay very close attention with the spending where it goes, just to ensure that we're in line. But I'm all about the Space Force. I would have joined it if I had the ability. Yeah, hoorah, Space Force.
Well, so what are your thoughts about the Cyber Force? Do you think that needs to be established as well? Do we need to establish it before the Space Force? I mean, these are real threats right now.
Yeah, well, obviously cyber is a threat now. And again, Cyber Force is in the United States Air Force. That's another thing that we don't really... Well, there's really cyber commands in all parts of the military, but it is a huge part of the United States Air Force. It's a big part of intelligence operations and all the other parts of the United States Armed Forces. So, again, if we were to establish a cyber command, which we already have one, like I said, that'd be fine. A lot of this is really semantics, and the majority of what we're talking about is actually the disbursement of funds and how to do that.
And centralizing things.
And centralizing it and how things are coordinated and whatnot. But, as I said, there is something called the United States Cyber Command. It's based out of Fort Meade, Maryland. So a lot of the mechanizations, a lot of the work that either the Space Force or the Cyber Force would do is already being done. So it's not like there's a hole to be filled or anything along those lines. We've had the Cyber Force or Cybercom, U.S. Cybercom, looks like since 2009 it was founded. And, I think it's just a matter of ensuring that the organization, both of these potential commands or both of these separate parts of the military are, organized and operationalized properly, and ensure that we're not sort of we're just creating another bucket for some free money to go into. And again, the American taxpayer is not paying close attention to it. So it's one thing to note is that do not be afraid when you hear, if we're not going to invest in the Space Force, that somebody comes in and gets rid of it, or, hey, we're not going to do the Cyber Force now. We do have operations happening in both these specific areas. It's just a matter of how we're going to organize it, how we're going to operationalize it, and how we're going to, have it go for the future. So it's just something good to note.
Yeah, it's basically based on priorities. I think it is a good thing. I think establishing commands is a good thing because that way they can focus on realistic problems that can happen in space and develop future technologies. When the Air Force was created, you're right, and they developed so many new planes and things like that because that was their singular focus. I think that the same needs to be done for the cyber forces. I understand we have all these forces; they're dispersed all over, but that's one thing with a centralized command, which really helps because the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. Essentially, in the U.S. military, is if you have one central commander, one central force that is focusing on a singular objective. That's why they established the Air Force to do that. So I think that both of these need to be established. I'm a little upset that they haven't talked about doing this a full cyber force yet, understanding that there are resources out there to do it. But I think that these need to be done, and it's very important that we do so.
Right. So for my present futures, I came across this Science Daily article. I don't know if you saw the same thing. It says artificial intelligence turns brain activity into speech, which is amazing, right? So,
Cool.
so none of the efforts described in these papers the last few months on the preprint server or BioRxiv managed to recreate the speech that people had merely imagined, but instead the researchers monitors parts of the brain of people either read aloud, silently mouthed, or listened to recordings, and they showed the reconstructed speech is understandable, is definitely exciting. That is a direct quote. So essentially what this is it's a computer model that allows us to think and then using artificial intelligence to help us actually generate the words. And there's actually even reconstruction of what the sounds are. So we'll put that in the show notes of what the speak is. So whenever you hit play, you can actually hear it count. You could hear it say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I think really only the 5, the 6, and the 7 is actually audible. But the accuracy is right now 75% here, which is actually, pretty astounding. So just to be clear what we're talking about, because, maybe I started off with that quote and it didn't make sense, is what we're saying is you think and a computer then speaks for you. So this is very similar to what, people know about Stephen Hawking or any other person who is, paraplegic. They can maybe use certain things with their eyes or their hands in order to speak. But this is actually direct sort of brain actions or brain sort of electrodes that are turned into speech. And then we're using artificial intelligence to sort of better formulate what that speech exactly is, what those sounds are. And of course, those sounds turn into sentences and all the rest. So just the beginning of us maybe possibly taking people that have inactive brains or brains that have an inability to do proper speech patterns, and actually turn it into something that we can understand what they're saying. And this is actually fantastic. And tell you the truth, Jack, I'm not sure if even this, but this affects my personal life. My father has a traumatic brain injury. He has ability, he has a disability in terms of an inability to speak himself. So this is extremely exciting. And because I, started to take a look at this and I listened to the weird computer language that came under there, I was like, boy, I feel like I've been hearing a lot about this stuff, this brain control stuff, but I haven't really kind of looked back into it. So I decided to kind of take a look at it. So what we're talking about essentially is BCIs, brain control interface. So sometimes this is called neural control interfaces, sometimes mind-machine interfaces, direct neural interfaces, brain-machine interfaces. Regardless, we're talking about a brain and a computer coming together and having a direct communication pathway between the brain and some sort of external device. This is really fantastic, right? And so, obviously we're, in the research stages still, but there is some of this stuff, out there in the world. But we'll come back to what's out there in the world. We'll just give you a little bit of a history of it. So essentially, this field, was started in the 1970s at UCLA under a grant from the NSF, the National Science Foundation, followed by a contract from DARPA. and numerous papers came out during the 70s that sort of talked about this first initial work. Now, keep in mind the initial work behind the electrical activity of the human brain actually goes all the way back to 1924, when Hans Berger discovered that there is electrical activity, the sort of neural processes that allow us to function, and he ended up developing electroencephalography, which of course allows us to record human brain activity. So that's sort of the baseline kind of science that sort of all of this is founded on. So, Berger's first sort of recording device was extremely simple. He basically inserted silver wires under the scalps of his patients. So just think this happened in 1920s. We're obviously a little bit better than that for now. But in some ways, this led to the analyzation or the analysis of all these different wave diagrams, and allowed Berger to check in on potential brain diseases, and then, of course, all types of new possibilities that we have going on now. So, let's talk also a little bit about, what's out there. And then I'll also maybe talk a little bit about, the types of BCIs, and then I'll sort of get your view on this. So you can actually do this now. And there's numerous companies, there's numerous products actually that are out there that you can actually use your brain to control things. So, when it comes to companies, I think we all know, right? Elon Musk, Neuralink, it's the American neurotechnology company founded by Musk and 8 others, where he plans on developing an implantable brain-computer interface to, help us connect and have symbiosis with artificial intelligence, which is really the long-term goal that Musk wants to do. And, part of what they want to do is, neuroprosthetics, of course, which allows the BCI to connect with prosthetics. So interpreting sort of brain signals, allowing disabled people to control their prosthetic arms. We'll talk a little bit more on the different types of BCIs in a little bit. Another company, Kernel, which was put forward by technology entrepreneur Brian Johnson. This one is where there's going to be chips implanted into brain to help people suffering from neurological damages caused by strokes or Alzheimer's or concussions. This is something my father has. So, neuroscientists are, building these chips, again, a neuroprosthetic, which they hope in the long term may be able to not only, boost the neuro capabilities of these patients, but also possibly intelligence, memory, and cognitive tasks, which is, pretty amazing too. So, Jack, you can get even smarter.
I like that.
Yeah, for sure, man. But there are so we'll go through. We'll go through at least like the different types of BCI, I guess, for now, and then I'll go to the different products. So, we've kind of already, mentioned some of these already. So obviously the neuroprosthetics, so the ability to use a BCI to help with motor control or movement. So that is restoring movement in individuals, or, providing devices to assist them. So whether it's either interface with computers, of course, what we're talking about when we're talking about folks like Stephen Hawking, but also interfaces with computers and robot arms. And you've already seen this, where someone can think about something and be able to close their fingers around it. So it's really fantastic to actually see that. There are vision. So there are invasive BCIs, which is implanted electrodes. So those work with movement, but also vision as well. So, you have invasive BCI research where it repairs damaged sight and allowing for new functionality for people with paralysis, or even implanting gray matter into the brain to allow them to see that much better. So there's a gentleman by the name of John Newman who had acquired blindness and now has some sort of, BCI vision in his eye. So it's particularly fantastic. There's partially invasive BCIs where they fit inside the skull but rest sort of outside the brain. So, sort of within the brain matter, and that allows for, all sorts of different electrical activity to be taken and be used. And then the sort of non-invasive BCIs are using the various electrical signals around the high frequency signals that the skull sort of produces to help us do things. So there are 10 products that I found, but there's all sorts that allow us to do this now for these BCIs. There's a game called, or by this company called NeuroSky, which is an EEG game where you can NeuroBoy and you can use the brain activity to sort of interact with virtual objects around you. There's another game, mind-controlled game called Judica, which was designed, which allows people to, to play, in this like real life world where you can like kill various animals and aliens sort of in this crazy world. There's a Star Wars Force trainer that Milton Industries partnered with NeuroSky with to design this illusion of possession of the Force, which is particularly crazy. So video games really is a part of this. One thing I saw, these ears that were designed by this company called NeuroWear, where the wearer gets to wear these like plush cat ears, and depending on what their mood is, like the ears change. So if they're like relaxed, they like sloop down. If they're interested, their ears perk up, and if they're focused, they perk up real quickly. So that's actually kind of cool. And of course, there's all sorts
Seems like
of
Big Brother.
Yeah, well, I mean, just about anything, right? So, I mean, just really fantastic. I know I've been blabbering on about BCIs for a while, but this stuff is just extremely exciting to me. And I mean, are you going to go ahead and get those cat ears, or what's next for you for BCIs?
Man, I'll tell you, I love BCIs. I think that so I don't go as crazy as Elon Musk, who predicts that unless we incorporate with artificial intelligence, we're going to be, his words, he said that we're going to be living in little more than big cages, where just like the last chimpanzees and mountain gorillas, where they eke out their existence unless we do this, because the world will be dominated by artificial intelligence. I do think that he's a visionary, though, and this electrode to neuron interface at this micro level, is implantable devices, these computer chips he wants to put in our brains. I think it has possibilities, and it's pretty neat. My question is, when can I become like Neo in the Matrix and learn karate in 2 days? That's a day. That's what I want to do. I mean, the possibilities for education, though, and communication are really important. Not only what you mentioned about helping people with disabilities. I mean, I think about, what if you're at like the United Nations and you have one of these implanted, and someone talks and you could hear in real time, and they're talking in their own language, and you can hear in real time in your language what they're saying, because it's implanted into your brain, and you can easily understand them. I love the idea of the future of gaming. You brought that up. I mean, that's something that's pretty cool, I think, the idea of, not only the gaming, but being able to go into the internet. I think Futurama has a really cool episode about it, where they go into the internet and they go into all these places. I think that's really cool. I don't know, man. BCIs are. I also have, this is the pessimist in me coming out and saying, also, I mean, I'm concerned if I implant something in my brain, is it hackable?
Right.
Can they go in and they can, say, oh, we can get into his brain and make him do things, or, there's all sorts of things. When you're dealing with the human brain, which is such a sensitive organ, if you think about it, I think we're still a long way off of really making this truly viable.
No, 100%. Now, you did play on something that was particularly interesting there, talking about, brain-to-brain interface. And matter of fact, Cornell University, they have this now. The brain net that they have. So essentially what it is, it's a brain to brain interface that allows for intercommunication between brains. So so we're not even talking about the BCI, we're talking the BBI, essentially, right? That. So scientists from Cornell University have invented the world's first non-invasive brain to brain interface called BrainNet. The interface combines EEG, the same Berger technology from 1924, to record brain signals, and transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, to deliver information to the brain. So we could do this podcast by just thinking about it, which would be amazing. Obviously we're still very early here. I think this is going to be one of those technologies where we're going to have to pay attention to. And my guess is too, BCIs in terms of their capabilities, but also the lexicon. Like when we say brain control interface, I think people understand it, but a lot of people don't get it, and they sort of haven't framed it yet. Sort of kind of like artificial intelligence was maybe 10 years ago. They kind of have an idea about it, but they're not sure. So I think as this technology continues to maybe find itself into the public space, more people sort of playing around with this sort of stuff, as well as it being, the technology continuing to evolving. I think it's going to be a technology to watch out for the future, and I'm interested to see where it's going to go. Okay, so we're going to do something a little bit different. Jack alluded to it in the introduction. We are doing Weird Futures. So, as you guys know, one of our segments has been Paleo Futures, where we introduced old movies, old stories, maybe elder futurist statesmen, sometimes even present stuff, which we thought was helpful to kind of give people a futures view. But as I started going through some of the futures topics that we've talked about, I saw that a lot of times theories came up, theories, frameworks, sort of ways of thinking. And, one reason why I think futures is important is that it sort of gives you a way to think about the future, think about change, think about where people and ideas and whole parts of the universe can go. And frameworks allow us to give us that view. So we're going to call these weird futures, weird things you didn't know it existed out there that's going to help you think about the future. So I think it's going to be a really great journey. So glad you decided to help us on it. So the first one we're going to talk about is a concept called spiral dynamics. And so, what is spiral dynamics? So spiral dynamics, it's a sort of data-based psychological approach to understanding worldviews and systems thinking held by individuals, organizations, and societies. And one easy way to take a look at it is actually to look at the many different spiral dynamics infographics that you see out there. So essentially, what spiral dynamics is it's the stages of life, of humanity, right? And the expressions of how humanity sort of builds upon itself. And so you can think of this as going from us as caveman coming right out of the caves and trying to figure out how to live, going all the way into the autonomous robotic machines and sort of everything in between. So, let's go through, a little bit of these stages, right? So the first one is the instinctive self. This is very basic, automatic, wish fulfilling. You're just trying to stay alive, right? You just come out of the cave and you're just trying to get water and shelter for somehow. The next stage is purple. And by the way, it's a spiral. So it is constantly growing, right? It starts kind of smaller and it gradually builds because you have more and more society around this. And, one way to view spiral dynamics is that it's particularly important to understand how whole societies are formulated and how they come together. And, I think what's interesting here is that this sort of view, this framework of spiral dynamics is used to differentiate like different cultures. And I think you'll see that as we go through these spirals, as we move from beige all the way to turquoise, which is, the highest level, or one of the highest levels. There might even be more beyond turquoise, but at least for now, it's turquoise. So as we move from beige to turquoise, you'll see that there may be whole societies you can envision that may be in that. So maybe the beige going into the purple may be a society that's, sort of just out of the Paleolithic age or just out of the Neolithic age. So going back to the spirals, moving from the beige, we're going to go to the purple, which is safety and security. So you're thinking tribalism, magic, mysticism, these sorts of things. And it's, keep the spirits happy and the tribe's nest will be warm and safe. So you would think, any early sort of, religious kind of dominated place that allows people to, keep going. And then as we go, you start to see more and more sort of social sort of mechanisms coming into place. So see purple, you have the establishment of religion. Up next is the red driver for power, glory, and rage and ravage. So this would be egocentric, exploitive. You would think of, the Mongol societies or the Huns or something along those lines. When we move to blue is the ultimate peace between good and evil, right? So it's absolutist, obedient, purposeful, or authoritarian. So a lot of religion and religious sort of values are sort of embedded in blue, where you're embedded with a life meaning and direction and purpose, and it gives you the outcome of where you need to go. You might see probably a lot of the sort of religious countries of the world or really orthodox, sort of religious sects. They may sort of embed themselves into this. After that is the orange or the achiever self. So orange desires autonomy, achievement, and self-interest. Think of this as material pleasure. So like America a little bit. Acquisition, advancement of society, sort of ultimate progress. So orange, you see businesses being built, science being built, medicine being operated on. You start to see sort of domination and hierarchies. In some ways, orange is, the wave between, the pre-industrial age and the industrial age all the way probably into our sort of information age. Green, still going up. It's still going up. Green is the sensitive self. So now green wants to go and look at connections, sort of community, egalitarianism. So you're thinking more of a pluralistic society. Maybe, the first sort of initial wave of this would be the hippie movement. So you're aware of human rights, aware of sort of animal rights, beginning of postmodernism, liberalism, and activism sort of is a part of this. Yellow is integral, so the integral self. So many lines of awakening of intelligence are coming together. Yellow is completely systemic. It's ecological. It's flexible. It's conceptual. A lot of you would think of some of the places like Norway and Japan. They may be making their way over to more of a yellow sort of way of systemic and ecological and flexible and capable sort of life spring. And then there's the turquoise, which is the holistic self. So this is all wholeness and existence exists in mind and spirit. It's profound multi-dimensional perspectives. And what's amazing is when you start to dive into spiral dynamics, there are just a grip of infographics and all sorts of things to sort of talk about the different stages of these developments. And what this does, and I'll give it back to you to sort of get your views on this view. And I'll go back to, it's a way of sort of thinking of how to attack problems in the world, or how to think of where countries are and where they could go. Afghanistan and America are very different. And, Iran and, Estonia may be very different. And a tribe in the Amazon versus a peasant farmer in Vietnam versus the, very modernized, Norwegian investment banker. They have different ideas, different cultural tones, sometimes different things that sort of push their life in certain directions. And having a framework like spiral dynamics allows you to understand where whole societies, whole groups are at. And you can kind of see how everything sort of kind of formulates and come together. So it's really kind of a holistic view of humanity and how humanity sort of builds upon itself throughout the decades and millennials and hundreds and thousands of years that we've been humans. And I think it's particularly helpful to sort of envision, where parts of society are at any given time. So yeah, Jack, what do you think about all this?
Well, man, it's interesting that it's this whole framework to think about society. I mean, I we're futurists, so I try to think about what the future society would look like, and I like this idea that you brought up of the Norways and the Japans of the world, possibly the evolution of of thought of society. And that's one thing that when I look at this framework, that's what I look at. I look at, well, what is Norway doing with its, it has its sovereign wealth fund, which is established for the well-being of everybody, all of the citizens of the country. That's something that I find that, if you look at it, it's just an evolution. I mean, sometimes it's a devolution, de-evolution of ideas, because, we had, some people say if we didn't have it the medieval age, we would be 200 years more advanced. I mean, that's kind of where we are. And I don't know. I like it. I think it's a unique. I think it's unique in that, and it reminds me of a scientist actually who's a political scientist, and he came up with this framework. Not this one, but he came up with the framework as well, where he was able to predict the future of global events by focusing on past experiences and past human ideas. I don't know if you're familiar with this guy, but he built this forecasting model, and it's actually fairly accurate. So much so that the CIA started paying attention to him, and he works with them, and he had like all this backing from big agents, big players, and I think that it's interesting to see that society is continuing to evolve this way, and that we can probably predict what's going to happen in the future based off of models like this.
Right, and and keep in mind whenever we discuss these models, as futurists, right, it's hard to ever predict how things are going to go. You can understand where futures could go, and I think that's what spiral dynamics does. Is it sort of gives us a framework, it gives us a view, a worldview of where things can go, and of course, it's relevant in a lot of different frameworks and ways of thinking, right? Leadership, conflict management, organizational change, how we communicate, how we market to groups, how cultures are going to transform, how what it's like to work in diverse communities. So, you have, what's happening, the European crisis that's happening, where you have refugee crisis, and different parts of maybe this spiral dynamics groups are working together, and you have to figure out how they do. And it's really cool that you actually brought up how different futures thinkers came up with this. We would do ourselves a disservice to not actually speak about where spiral dynamics originated from. It was really built on research done in 1950s and 60s by Dr. Claire Graves from Union College, New York. Graves, he just wanted to understand why people were different, and why do people change, why do some not, and sort of how the mind responds to the world that's growing more and more complex. And in some ways, that's what spiral dynamics is it's the complexity. It becomes more and more complex as we sort of go up the spiral. That's how you sort of get integral all the way through, because you have to have sort of combined the whole view. After that, two gentlemen, Cohen and Turdovic, Chris Cohen, pardon me, and Natasha Korterick, sorry, not gentleman, but gentleman and woman. They built the pattern together, or they built this view so they built upon it, and then they then spoke and connected it with another person, Ken Wilber, who later became known for his integral theory, which we'll probably bring up as well. So Cohen now works with Natasha Todorovic, and they have a spiral dynamics teaching that remains pretty close to the original work, which is pretty amazing. So this is really humans and humanity has always been at the center of futures. And, I think it's always at the center of what are the tools in the toolkit that futurists use. And in some ways, I think that's what Weird Futures is about using these different frameworks, tools, sometimes pieces of technology, pieces of software to enable us to actually think where futures can go. And I think that spiral dynamics is a fantastic one to start out with, especially since there's just so much stuff out there. So feel free to Google spiral dynamics. You'll see all sorts of different infographics that allow you to understand it infinitely way better than I can describe. They're super easy to follow, super easy to go through. There's a lot written on it too. And I think you'll see that you could definitely use spiral dynamics to even envision where certain parts of the world are and, where they need to be. It's just an interesting way to think about the world. And, I'm really, really glad that we get a chance to share it with you.
Want some money?
All right, folks, it's time for FizBiz.
FizBiz.
Yeah.
All right.
And since we aren't going to give out any financial advice this time, per se in this segment, we aren't going to give you our customary "please don't sue us" statement because we don't have any money anyways. We're not going to give that spiel. Instead, just enjoy listening to what we have to say on the big business of data. So yeah, let's start talking about data. So the modern business marketplace is a data-driven environment. The role of data is to empower business leaders to make decisions based on facts, trends, and statistical numbers. Human resources directors are gathering data from online resources to determine the best people to recruit and confirm details about them. Marketing departments are lasering in on market segmentation data to find consumers who are ready to buy, speeding up the sale closing process whenever possible. Business executives must examine bigger trends in the market, such as changes in pricing of resources, or manufacturing, etc. If you know someone who doesn't deal with data analytics, you've probably heard about data breaches in the news, about how Facebook and Google are collecting your data and selling it to the highest bidder, and movements and laws in Europe that are designed to protect your data and place a firm claim on who owns it. Heads up, they say it's you. So it's quite obvious that data itself is a big, complicated business. So to start about to kind of tell about what data is and how the traditional term of data. So it's always been a way to understand a target market. It doesn't matter if you're a European ruler and call your House of Lords together to gauge their opinion on a piece of legislation or the idea of raising taxes, or if you're a traditional marketing house in the Common Era and you send out opinion polls to find out if a product your customers are leasing will be a hit or a success. Data is collected to understand the world around us in a political, social, and economic standpoint and to make informed decisions. Until we reached the information or the digital age, lots of data was collected, but it was hard to collect large amounts of information on a general group and even harder to access that data after it was collected. So since the digital age, reams of information are now being able to be stored. Computer algorithms have been created to help us sift through and understand this data, and the amount of data collected on people has multiplied 100-fold, maybe 1,000-fold. Nowadays, instead of having to worry about what you say in public or what you answer on a test or a survey, now you have to worry about what you say in your private life, what you look up on the internet, and every single aspect of your life, which is heavily tied to your cell phone, has been placed under scrutiny, and this is the reason we're bringing this topic up. There's also the idea of big data, which means many things to many different people, but essentially means data collected in the digital age. I think that's the best way I can describe it. So what do companies do with this data, and how do they collect and use it? So way back at the turn of this decade, a German politician in 2009, he requested his data from his cell phone company. The data it collected stunned him. And you have to remember, this is the early days of smartphones. The data constantly showed, his name was Malt Spitz, and they showed his location as he traveled from Berlin to another city, how he sent 29 text messages as he traveled. And then on November 5th, 2009, he rocked out to U2 at the Brandenburg Gate. On January 10th, 2010, he made 10 outgoing phone calls while on a trip to Dusseldorf, and spent 22 hours, 53 minutes, and 57 seconds of the day connected to the internet. Now, that's just in 2009. Imagine what your smartphone's collecting now with all of the different uses that you can use it for. And that was 10 years ago. So all of this showed that, one, your internet searches are being recorded, that you may possibly get stuck in a filter bubble. Imagine this, that we aren't shown things by a search engine like Google, because it learns your behaviors that challenge your, and so it learns your behaviors, and then it doesn't show you things that might challenge your established beliefs or worldview. Say you're a ardent Trump supporter, and it won't show you, something that's on the internet that's maybe a fact refuting what he says, and then you believe that to be actual fact, as opposed to all of these different studies that are out there that say it isn't. That's just an example. So the government has access to your data, and so they can also know where you are, all of these things, just by requesting this data. Things like your address book is being collected, and a recent survey actually found that 11% of the apps in the Apple iStore or Apple Store collect your address book. So everybody that you know, all the phones, addresses, everything that gets collected and by this random company. So Chris, I want to ask you, what types of data do you think are being collected, and what do you think they're being used for outside of what I just said?
Well, I could speak on this forever because I've been sort of covering analytics and artificial intelligence, and both of which those are baseline technologies, which are driven primarily through data. Yes, there's a lot of data out there, but I mean, let me tell you, a lot of it's like total crap.
Yes.
And a lot of it is really hard to kind of figure out how to use it properly. Are a lot of companies that are figuring out how to harness certain types of data. A lot of companies are sort of embedding either phones or different platforms and then using the platform or solution or whatever to then be able to digitize or turn that data into something. Then some companies are actually taking their old tried and true work, like Rolls-Royce engines or GE, and they're actually digitizing these what we would think of as just normal operating things into data, so we can have real-time sort of work in terms of how to fix this data when there's going to be maintenance sort of shutoffs, all sorts of things. So the world of data is like anything in futures or really just in the world. It's complicated. And there's a lot of data harvesting out there. Obviously we think of Facebook, we think of, what's happening in China with all their social networks. Is it nefarious? Yes. Should we have, ideas on how to regulate it? Yes. Should we start to move to regulate some of these things that may have too much tentacles into our data? I was watching South Park actually just the other day, and they had this 2-episode arc where they were speaking on Jeff Bezos and how he's always listening in, and it had like Jeff Bezos like listening in like Alexa, and he's because he wants to listen to the customer, because keep in mind, Amazon is collecting data every single time you buy something, whether it's Amazon, whether it's any of these other engines that we use to purchase things, and we don't go to the mall anymore. They're collecting customer data. They're collecting every single time you log in with your Facebook ID. That's sort of customer data that's being collected. So we are swimming in data right now. All these companies are swimming in it. And what's a sort of a crazy thing about it is actually only probably 10%, and I would say probably even less, are actually doing something productive with it. And probably only 1 or 2% of these companies are actually doing something then, which would be viewed as sort of nefarious or not particularly helpful. I do think though that people like see things like, oh, my cell phone heard me, and then an ad came up. That's definitely nefarious. I think that's definitely something to think about. But to tell you the truth, I don't necessarily even mind that sometimes. Sometimes I want to get an ad when I'm talking about going to Cabo with my wife, or I want to get, I was just talking Chinese, and now I have ads showing me the local Chinese place that's, really good. Maybe get a coupon or something along those lines. So, now, of course, I am a millennial, borderline millennial Gen Xer. And so maybe my culture is going to allow me to, to deal with that and to deal in that sort of data connected world. But I got to say, there's so much data with a lot of these companies collecting all this information, and you'd be surprised how little of it is being properly sort of, rejiggered and used by these companies. And matter of fact, it's a race to figure out how to properly sort, clean, analyze, disperse, and then use that data to help propel sales, to help better customer service, to help do all this sort of stuff. And, unfortunately, we're just not there yet. There's a lot of companies trying to get there as quickly as possible. It's going to be a great space to invest in, to pay attention to and whatnot. But, as of right now, being completely scared of what's out there and what's being collected. Yes, there's a lot being collected, but there is stores of stuff that companies are just doing nothing with.
Well, and you brought up a good topic to talk about, is that that's why we're having this on FizBiz, is because there are so many companies right now that are trying to gather data or trying to find the best way to deal with data, to organize it, to monetize it, and you're right. As millennials, I think we're a little bit more open to the fact of our data just being out there, and we're being okay with that because you're right. Alexa listens to everything you say. There's the idea of that, your TV might be listening to what you're saying. There's all sorts of things that are out there that are listening, that are gathering your data. And you're right, not a lot of it is being utilized either correctly or being utilized at all. It's just being collected and stored in some data center somewhere, which is part of the reason why I'm bringing this up, because then there's that security concern as well. Because there's the financial aspect of, there's all these companies that, our listeners might want to pay attention to, that are collecting and probably properly using this data to do something monetize with, either nefariously or not nefariously. That's where I wanted to bring up, obviously, GDPR. That's something that us in the tech world are very familiar with. It stands for the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a European law that basically established the ownership of your user data and the right to be forgotten by companies. So the right for it basically states that you own your own data, and that companies that collect that, you have the right to then say, hey, I don't want you collecting that anymore, or hey, I want my file, I want to see what you have on me, or you can say, I want you to delete it. That's a really important aspect of it, and that's why American companies and everything that are set up to collect all this data are having so much issues in Europe right now, because you can't also transfer that data into different countries. It has to stay in the country that it was originated in. And I think that's a great way to do it. You were talking about how we need to be establishing this framework, this talk about what we need to do with this. I mean, cybersecurity is a huge risk. You may be comfortable with it, but you have to realize that almost everyone in the United States has been affected by cyber espionage, cyber hacking and things like that. Whether it's your credit card being stolen or your banking account information being stolen. I mean, your social security number, your credit history, or even worse, your search history. That's for all the perverts out there who might be searching things that you may not want other people to know about. You have to have, there's actors that you have. These are outside actors. These aren't the companies that maybe and or might trust. These are people that are selling your credit card information online. You have no control over how they're getting this information, because these companies are collecting all this information and then they're not protecting it. They're just storing it in some server somewhere, and then maybe Joe Schmo, who's the tech working on that server, steals everyone's credit card information or steals your social security numbers and sells them for $1 each. Just ask. And if you want to say, how does this again affect me? Just ask some of our most famous people in the United States when they had their pictures and text messages stolen from Apple. A company that a lot of us trust, because we think, well, they're so big, they must have all these protections and stuff. But then there was also all this data that was stolen from Snapchat, where just regular people, all of their data was taken and in compromising ways, so that then they were blackmailed. There was histories of blackmails and stuff like that. Like, that's real stuff that we need to be concerned about, and as a financial person, and we're considering the realms of finance, that we need to be protecting. So, and then finally, I just want to say that as we mentioned recently, governments like China are collecting this data and using it to control their populace. China watches its citizens, creates a social profile on their actions, and then prevents people from access to state resources, if you don't do what they want you to do. So there's a lot of concerns with big data and what's the future of big data is. And I think that as a financial person and as a person who might work in tech or just who are interested in this, you need to be paying attention to big data, and you need to be paying attention to regulation around big data, because this is going to be, I think, an issue of this century is, what exactly can be collected, what should be collected, how it should be used. I think that's very important, because we do have private lives and we have the right to privacy. And that's something that, we should be able to tell a company, hey, you cannot collect this. And if you do, you have to delete it immediately. I think that's something that's extremely important. And Europe is going in the right direction, but the United States is kind of not. So, Chris, I'm going to give you the last words. What are your biggest concerns? Is what I'm going to ask. What are your biggest concerns with big data? And, how will we handle this in the future? I mean, you talked about companies that you think that are using it, and you were okay with it. But what are those concerns that you have, having worked in this space? And what do you think is the future of big data?
Well, one thing we didn't talk about is while we've been talking about regulations, and obviously I think that's extremely important. Things like GDPR. I wouldn't mind if the United States did this. If anything, I think a lot of our companies are forced to, because we live in a tighter, integrated global thing. So GDPR is already affecting us. And a lot of you who may be seeing new ways of you might get emails, or new ways of logging into your products and services. All of that's sort of pushed by GDPR. So that's actually good to note. but I do see that as a major future. So as you said, there's going to be more sort of regulatory sort of mechanisms out there in the world, and I think that's extremely important. One thing we have not mentioned here is self-regulation. So paying attention to the your personal usage, and you have the ability to say no to certain products and services that you think are not worthy of having this data collected. I am seeing a lot of sort of negative news about Facebook, and I'm hearing of a lot of people who are jumping off of that bandwagon. And economy is the best way to sort of get rid of the malactors when it comes to these things. So be willing to not only look at your personal capabilities when it comes to securing your data, but also be willing to use your pocketbook to be able to invest in companies that are using your data in a proper way. One thing we talk about is companies that are pursuing sustainable business models and humane business models. And I think this is seen as something that's positive when it comes to investing in companies. You see, we're talking about Starbucks, and they got rid of what we think is a pretty lame environmental concern, but it's those sorts of concerns that it embeds themselves into the stock market, embeds themselves into the stock, into the ideas, the psyches of the many people who take those products and services around the world. And I wouldn't doubt that in the future that data management is going to be sort of a humane and sustainable thing that people are going to be able to work on. So I think that those two things are particularly important. In terms of the future of data and future of big data, welcome to an algorithm world. I think, and I'm not the one who is going to put that or who coined that phrase. There's a lot of people who sort of look at the world as an algorithm world. I think you're going to be seeing more data science embedded in all different industries. You're going to be seeing people that didn't have, data analytics capabilities be able to use things at the very easily in all different industries, from your local restaurant to maybe your barber who has an accounting mechanism, to maybe even your auto mechanic who's going to look to see population statistics when it comes to certain cars. So you're going to see really an explosion of data and data analysis, and in turn, how to actually communicate that data analysis, how to crunch the numbers, how to use products and services that are based on very specific needs in many markets. So data is going to drive our future society for many years and many decades to come. Data, I guess, needs as a workforce need is going to be important for everybody, so that's going to be particularly important. And honestly, it's going to be worth billions and billions of dollars. From because I'm saying it's going to embed itself into every single industry. That means every industry is going to need technicians, going to need data scientists, are going to need people who run the platforms, people who work who are janitors inside the companies that are doing this stuff. So data is going to be a part of our society. It's going to drive the future of our economy. Any country and any company that's willing to invest in these sorts of technology and a workforce in order to drive it is going to be rewarded, I think, handsomely. So big data is here to stay, and it's going to drive the world for many years to come.
All right, guys. Thank you for joining us here for our interview segment today. We are really excited about our guests. We have Chris Chappel and Shelly Zang. They're the co-hosts of America's most popular TV show focusing on China. It's called China Uncensored. It's broadcast in major U.S. cities and on YouTube. They also host a weekly podcast called China Unscripted, where you can get an entertaining rundown of what's happening in China, as well as interviews with a variety of China experts. You can listen to China Unscripted on iTunes or by visiting ChinaUnscripted.com. I know that they have a lot of YouTube videos out there that are very popular. So, and that's actually how we first discovered you guys is through your YouTube videos, always funny and informative. And we're really excited to have you guys on the show.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm really excited to talk to a couple of futurists.
Yeah.
Have you guys figured out psychohistory yet?
Definitely not. No.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm a little less excited then.
No, the history of Psycho we have. No, not psychohistory. but so yeah, we invited you guys on the show to talk about obviously the future. And one thing that we really wanted to focus on is the future of China, that and the future of Chinese-U.S. relations specifically. It's something that comes up quite often on our show. A lot of our listeners are very intrigued with what's going on in China. So without, basically what we're going to do is ask you guys a bunch of questions and get your insights on these things. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our first question, and we'll go from there. So Chris and Shelly, so I know that you guys have covered things like Chinese IP theft, CCP specifically, their CCP IP theft a lot on your show, and we've even shared your segment on the government sanctioned practice. So I just have to ask you guys, when we start this, because, obviously we could go into so many different avenues when it comes to what's going on in China, the CCP, everything that's going on. Can you touch on the recent trade war, tariffs, all of that stuff? Because, that's in public news right now. How is that affecting U.S.-Chinese relations? Let's start with that.
Well, I think it's important for people to kind of understand the scope of, for example, Chinese intellectual property theft. So there's a saying that there are only two types of companies in the U.S., companies that have been hacked and companies that don't know they've been hacked. And so often what you find is a lot of these companies, they don't want to reveal that they've been hacked because that is trouble for the CEOs, that's trouble for the stocks of the company. I actually know one security expert named Casey Fleming. He's chairman of a company called Black Ops Partners. According to him, he's worked with these kind of companies, especially the ones that don't necessarily want to go public about the hacking. And he said that it costs the U.S. $5 trillion each year, or 30% of the U.S. GDP when you factor in the full value of the stolen innovation. So this is kind of what the environment was like before the U.S.-China trade war. Do you want to jump in with anything, Shelly?
Yeah, I think what's happening now is that a lot of people are, you could look at it from a short-term or a long-term thing, like the tariffs and the trade war. And I think also what's bleeding into this is Trump himself.
We talk about Trump a lot.
Yeah. So, depending on how people feel about Trump, that really colors how they feel about the trade war as well.
Yeah. The interesting thing, though, is that a lot of the current administration's moves against China actually has gotten a lot of bipartisan support. I remember even Chuck Schumer saying, I'd like to give Trump a pat on the back, which was shocking to hear Chuck Schumer say that about Trump.
Chuck Schumer, Elizabeth Warren has, supported the tariffs.
Pocahontas herself.
Oh, we're not going to go there, Chris.
Bernie Sanders, I think, too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's really because China is not a Republican or a Democrat issue. It affects everyone in the United States.
Sometimes we joke about how China is going to bring America together.
Make America great again?
Make America great again. But yeah, joking aside, though, I think what we are seeing, and I think a lot of people don't know this yet, but what we're seeing is a fundamental shift in how the U.S. government is looking at China and the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party. And not just the U.S. government, it's happening.
You see it around the world.
Yeah, with a lot of liberal democracies, Australia, even Canada, the UK. So it's starting.
New Zealand needs some work.
Yes. Yeah. But I think it is, when we talk to people in Washington from, think tanks, policy experts, people in the Trump administration, that there's a fundamental shift happening with seeing, I believe the way they've put it is, instead of cooperation, strategic competition.
I remember that. Yeah. It's not win-win cooperation, as Xi Jinping would like to say.
And then building off of that, then, because we do try to stay very neutral in this. I tend to be more of the pessimist, and Christopher tends to be more of the
optimist.
Optimist.
Yeah.
I can
half full.
Yeah, half full guy. And one thing that I wanted to ask you guys specifically is I know that you guys were recently there, and I want to touch on you guys were recently in Taiwan. But I really wanted to recently touch about what you guys think the future of the Chinese government is. I know one thing that you guys have talked about is the CCP and the systemic kind of program that they've done to I mean, we've talked specifically about the social credit system that they're installing in China to kind of maintain their rule. So tell us a little bit more about what you guys feel the CCP and the U.S. or what their relationship is like, and what you see that future of that relationship going, and if the CCP can even continue.
Well, I think one thing important to keep in mind is that China has a 5,000-year continuous history. Its dynasties have come and gone, and China will still be there even after the Chinese Communist Party is gone.
Will the Chinese Communist Party be gone in the next 5 years or 10 years or 50
I hope it's
years?
around for a long time, otherwise I'm out of a job. I'd have to talk about U.S. news and politics instead.
Boring.
And just be all full of Trump stuff. So,
but I think with the Chinese Communist Party, it will last until China's economy collapses,
and that ties to the trade war.
Yeah.
And so, do you think that trade war is just going to continue? I mean, what's the end game of that?
Well, actually, let me interject here a little bit, because I think this will spin into an interesting segue here. One thing I was picking up on some of your videos is the inability for us to really ascertain how powerful China could be in its economic prowess, right? I mean, you could say probably the same thing about the United States, but China is somewhat insulated in the fact that they are under this communist, totalitarian regime, and they could do whatever they want. They could say whatever they want about when it comes to their growth, the economy, and whatnot. So I'm wondering, maybe not only just talking about the economy in general, but maybe let's talk about what is real. What is real about their economic progress? I mean, we see these outstanding numbers, but we also see these empty buildings and these empty cities. So, they could just be producing work that is nothing's really happening, behind it. So maybe we could just talk a little bit about not only the future of the Chinese economy, but the future of the real, quote unquote, Chinese economy.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's very hard to know exactly what is actually happening to the Chinese economy, because even the current Chinese premier, Li Keqiang, has said in the past that China's GDP numbers are man-made and therefore unreliable. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of ways like local government officials will inflate GDP numbers by, for example, a skyscraper boom, where they're just building and building and building. And on paper, it seems like everything's going very well. But the reality is it's a bubble.
Right. And is there any sort of, I guess, action plan maybe in the future to deal with these possible bubbles and crashes? One thing about us, right, in the United States and really in westernized democracies is that we have seen these economic bubbles come up and then crash and then come back up. I mean, we've been living with this really for about probably the past 150 to 200 years. China really only opened itself completely to the westernized democracy or westernized economy, starting in the, we could say the 60s, 70s, didn't really start to churn maybe until the 80s and 90s. And now they're, our economic powerhouse, right next to the United States. So is maybe China ill prepared to deal with a crash or a recession? Is its middle class, its growing middle class, as well as where the recession hits the worst is always the lower and middle classes. So is China prepared to deal with this? And is there any implications for them not being properly prepared when it comes to both the cities and the rural areas of China?
Well, I would say comparing how we deal with bubbles in the U.S. with China, it's like a completely different situation, because social stability in China is much more tied into the economic growth than it is here in the U.S. So what's happening in China is that people have like a lot of confidence in the Chinese government, in the Chinese Communist Party, that if something goes downhill, the government will bail them out.
That's a nice thing about a big brother.
Yes, except so far it has happened, but that doesn't mean it can continue to happen, because like we talk about China's stock market and how it's not really indicative of like the health of the economy. It's kind of more like, it's like it's gambling. Like in Chinese, you call it like stir frying stocks. And it really is like, it's about like the daily up and down, and people kind of like bet on the markets. So there's like a lot of wild fluctuations, and it's happened in the past that there have been crashes, and then the Chinese government will step in and say something that will stabilize the markets or like make things go back up. So people have this confidence that they'll always be there to protect it. And I think that's what they also have about the real estate bubble that is growing bigger and bigger in China now, and like the general debt crisis that we've talked about a few times, like shadow banking, all of this debt that's off the books, that when people default, it will be like what happened in 2008, but on a much larger scale. But there is this kind of optimism, or just this idea that like, well, the Chinese government would never let the economy crash. And that is because of the bargain that they've made with the Chinese people about like, you do not complain about what your political freedoms, whatever. We give you the freedom to make money.
And I want to touch on that, because that's something I read somewhere recently that said there's tons of protests going on in China every day, and it's just something that no one sees because the government's covering it up. They control the media and everything like that. So my question for you guys is: the future of China communist?
I mean, the one thing you have to say about the Chinese Communist Party is that they have so far been able to plug up all the holes, or avert each catastrophe that's come its way somehow. How long they can continue to do that? At some point, it's just going to become too much. So, I mean, I personally don't think that ultimately the Chinese Communist Party is a stable system. Like, you can't have a functional, like it's you can clearly see like the economy is not stable, the political situation is not stable, and like that's because you need to have an honest social contract for a society to be stable long term.
And also, it's an interesting thing about how the Chinese Communist Party regards social stability. And social stability for them means the absence of any possible threat to stability. It's not just like, there's no middle ground. So it's like everything has to be squashed, because I think that shows how fragile they believe their hold-on power is.
That's a very important idea when looking at China. And you can see that, like, when you look at the Chinese Communist Party through that framework, you understand why there are these mass campaigns against Christians, the Uyghur Muslims, the Falun Gong, like anything that could
Tibetans.
be. The Tibetans.
Can't forget the Tibetans.
Yeah.
People in Hong Kong even.
Yeah.
Well, and so, I mean, and based on that, I know you guys were, and I hope I can talk about this. I know you guys said you were recently in Taipei, right? What are people's thoughts there? Because I've been talking with a Chinese military expert recently. Actually, we've connected online, and he wrote this long report about how China needs to invade Taiwan in the next year to avoid massive bloodshed. And that seems to be, he said that's a very prevalent thought in the Chinese military, I guess, circles. And so what are the thoughts right now going on in the people in Taiwan? I don't know if you had to talk to a lot of people. Is there a fear that China is going to do something soon, or that there just a general fear?
Well, I know on the show we've spoken to Ian Easton, part of the Project 2049 Institute, and he's talked a lot about how the Chinese Communist Party views Taiwan and the necessity of an invasion. He also talks about how practically difficult that would be to accomplish, and some of that has to do with just the location of Taiwan. The Strait of Taiwan is not an easy thing to send your ships across, especially China's Navy is completely untested. So the people in Taiwan, I don't know. Did you get a sense of that particular?
Like, I don't get a sense that they're afraid that, because for the many, many years, the Chinese Communist Party, the PLA, has talked about like the goal of like retaking Taiwan by 2020. But I don't get the sense that people in Taiwan take that very seriously. Yeah. You also have to remember that it's been many, many years since there was any kind of like military and direct military engagement between Taiwan and the mainland. So,
and when we were in Taiwan, we even went to an island called Jinmen, which is located about roughly 5 miles off the coast of China that for decades was shelled by the People's Liberation Army. But even today, people are there. They're not living under fear of invasion. Like a couple of years ago, I was in South Korea when North Korea was a little more aggressive with its nukes, and even the feeling there was more tense than at least the feeling I got in Taiwan this time. And they were also very concerned about their local elections that were happening at the time too. That was the big thing. That was the talk of the day.
I guess I'm surprised by that because but I guess when you've lived under it for so long, for decades, that the imminent threat of Chinese invasion, it's just not something that you think about. And I mean, one thing that we've talked about specifically on the show is what if we do a lot of what ifs, because obviously we're futurists. We talk about, well, what if China did launch an attack against Taiwan, or what if a jet hits another jet when they're in the Senkaku Islands. When they're in Japan and China are trying to do that. Do you see a potential military conflict happening anytime soon, or do you think that because obviously you have two superpowers who have very intense trade ties to each other, do you see that just not happening? That we would figure out any conflict that may happen?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party is very focused on invading other countries, but not through the military, not through military action. They have a concept called unrestricted warfare, where it's basically you try to achieve the same ends of war, but not necessarily with like troop on the ground action. And this is where you see the Chinese Communist Party. This is what they're very good at, how they get money into the pockets of political candidates in countries they want to influence, how they influence the media, how they buy up Chinese language media. There was a very good book about the situation in Australia by Clive Hamilton called Silent Invasion, where you see that even churches in Australia that cater to mostly a Chinese congregation, they would even be posting propaganda from the Chinese Communist Party. So these more subtle ways of influencing and subverting liberal democracies, that's, I think, where the much greater threat is. Yeah, I don't see the Chinese military as being up to snuff yet. Like they couldn't take on the United States. And that kind of a conflict would only be massively destructive for everyone involved.
Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. So, let's shift gears a little bit. We talked a little bit about the technology at the beginning, and it's an extremely important issue not only for this podcast but just in general. And China has an interesting, sort of direction when it comes to this. They're already a world leader in artificial intelligence. That race just started, and they're already leading there. More PhDs in STEM education than anyone. But, I'm just wondering if we should be cautious, about some of their pursuits in these areas, especially even when it comes to bioengineering. It was just this week that there was a report that Chinese scientists have already used the CRISPR technology, the genetic editing software technology, to possibly create designer babies. And this is actually something that the noted historian Yuval Noah Harari has discussed, where, in the future, how you're going to have a Bill of Rights when you're going to have superhumans and whatnot. And there's no real regulation against the rise of technology, not only in its disruptive sort of areas, but also in its ways that it could be destructive to human society. So just wondering, what do you think about China's ideas when it comes to technology? We were just talking about not only the social credit system, so we can maybe talk a little bit about that, but also maybe even when it comes to things like bioengineering, CRISPR technology, designing, we were just talking about the military designing super soldiers, designing crazy Olympians, designing anything, right? They have a less of a sort of regulatory or parliamentary system that we do in the West. So does that mean that they could do anything they want when it comes to these technology pursuits? And I don't know, how do you guys feel about, the directions that they're going?
Well, there's definitely a lot of topics there. Let me give a little bit of background, and then you can remind us to talk about any of the specifics of that. So the Chinese Communist Party learned a lot about intellectual property theft from the Soviets, but they really perfected the techniques that had been used by the Soviets. So a couple decades ago, China was nowhere near the technological powerhouse it is today. And the reason they were able to do that is because they actually wrote intellectual property theft into their economic model. They created what they call technology transfer centers, places that were specifically geared towards, they would have Chinese state-backed hackers steal intellectual property theft, and these centers would reverse engineer technology and then give them directly to Chinese companies. And then that was going on for a number of years. But then in sort of 2015, they kind of changed tactics a little bit. So that's when you saw then President Obama and Xi Jinping meeting, and there was sort of this agreement that there would be no more hacking for intellectual property theft. And a lot of experts we've spoken to have said that really that did stop, or not stop, but it decreased tremendously. But what was happening at the same time in China, they were passing laws that basically made it so they didn't have to hack companies as much anymore. In 2015, they passed the national security law that to make all key network infrastructures and information systems secure and controllable. There was a counterterrorism law that requires internet service providers to help authorities decrypt data and provide technical means to support in terrorism cases, quote unquote. 2016 was a cybersecurity law that required network operators must accept government supervision. And how the Chinese Communist Party forces Western companies working in China to obey these laws and work with Chinese companies and give up their source codes. This was basically a giant backdoor into the intellectual property of foreign companies. So that's the background of how this sort of technological revolution inside of China happened.
In terms of how China deals with technology and like how whether they're so much more advanced than we are and these kinds of things, I think what's interesting about what's happening with technology in China is that you're kind of seeing it's a little bit of a Wild West in the sense that it's technology without like the restraining like ethical conundrums or like the public opinion like issues.
Public opinion doesn't matter much.
No. So like I think for a lot of companies, like a lot of these Chinese companies that are doing this facial recognition stuff, or even like when Cisco was helping the Chinese Communist Party build the Great Firewall, these kinds of things were like, okay, well, like it's almost like a ground to test all of this technology that you can do without having to worry about whether it's ethical to wall off the internet for an entire country or not, because it's legal. You know, it doesn't matter if it's moral. If it's legal, then this is kind of like the language that Google is using now about like whether or not they're going to go back into China, right? Where it's like, oh, well, like, of course, Google in China would be a little different because China has different laws.
I think they just came out and said that sometimes you do have to compromise your core values.
Well, or like things like
all of them.
Yeah. Like, wouldn't China be better if Google could go in there? And when, like, I think I saw like a China scholar Tigger said this on Twitter, and it's very true. The real question is whether the world needs a Google that can be compromised by the Communist Party or can't be compromised by the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah.
So like I think for a lot of the Chinese and like foreign companies in the technology sector, it's a lot of like, this is like Wild West experimentation, which is exciting, but also alarming.
As is the case with the twins that were just gene edited.
Yeah.
Right.
The other thing I would say about Chinese technology is sometimes it looks good on the surface, but you don't know if they're actually doing what they say they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
And it happens a lot with like I think more like the AI stuff that they're talking about, or like there's all these questions about quantum computing, if that's happening or not, or how far they've actually gotten in the research. Like,
I mean, keep in mind, China is still not really able to build jet engines.
Good point.
Like they still are basically importing them from the Soviet Union.
So they're copying the
not Soviet
yeah.
Union, Russia.
I mean, like a few weeks ago, the Chinese state-run media Xinhua claimed that they had like built the first AI TV anchor, like news anchor.
I saw that.
Yeah, and they were like calling this AI, but it was in no way AI. It was just like a CGI news anchor.
But they was reading a pre-written script.
Yeah. So in some cases, like when you see these Chinese companies come out and say, we've developed like gait recognition. So like you don't need facial recognition. We can recognize all sorts of people walking. Like maybe,
Yeah, I mean, they say a lot. There was a recent story about how they're going to build an artificial moon to
I saw
provide
that.
light. Yeah, or another example, like the Three Gorges Dam. Like that's a massive engineering project that was able to happen because it didn't matter the environmental impact. It didn't matter the impact on like cultural or archaeological sites. It didn't matter the impact on people's lives. They can just do whatever they want, and they don't have to answer to anybody.
Yeah, and
whoever
I think
in charge.
Absolutely, and I think that's like, so let's pull back. Let's go back a little bit here because I think this is an interesting, sort of point that we're talking about. We're talking about these different parts of the Chinese society, but maybe just culturally, not only how the government sort of does its actions, but also just general, maybe just kind of the pursuit of a better China. And, we have a parliamentary system in much of the West. We have a Republican system in the United States. We have to wait for Congress to pass legislation. There has to be quibbling, and there's these elections and all this sort of stuff. And in turn, we actually can't do the investments that China can do in multiple ways, not only the educational investments, the military investments, whether it's fake or not, they can do and go faster than we can in a multitude of areas. I mean, say what you want negatively about the social credit system. That's probably already happening in the United States. It might even happen, maybe even the consumer side of much of the West as well. So, we can poo-poo that all we want, but China is going to be able to figure it out and sort of work out the bugs because they can sort of make these inroads that much quicker. So maybe, I don't know, is it maybe an advantage because China has the ability to make quick moves, make decisive, moves in order to help propel their society, or is it a disadvantage? And by the way, advantage could mean advantage for China and disadvantage for the West, right? So, because of course, that's what we're talking about, that strategic competition. So I just wonder, maybe we can talk a little bit about China's ability to move quickly when it comes to moving their government, moving their country, and how that, of course, might affect, the multitude of different, areas involving Chinese society.
Well, I definitely have some thoughts on that. But Shelly, I think you want to say something?
Go.
Well,
She's shooing you.
Okay. So here's an important point that I think people need to understand when looking at modern China and the Chinese Communist Party that gets lost. There's this idea that the Communist Party is this monolithic entity that is unified and like they have a single vision. That is completely false.
But what about the China dream?
Oh, the China dream. It's a nightmare. But no, like when you look at the history of communism, it's based on a culture of struggle where people are struggling against each other. And that doesn't disappear. Like that's still happening today within the Chinese Communist Party. There is massive political infighting. A lot of what is happening in China today is just a result of essentially political faction under Xi Jinping trying to survive in the face of the political faction that was established under the old guard, the former Chinese leader, Jiang Zemin. So it is not like, for better or for worse, the Communist Party is able to march together to a future, be that a wonderful new future or a horrible authoritarian 1984 future. It is not a unified vision. So that's big.
I think in terms of moving quickly, there's something that like we kind of envy here in the West about, like, I think people talk about this all the time. Like, people like Thomas Friedman will be like, oh, well, like the bullet trains in China, or like this idea that like basically you measure progress by how quickly you can move. So there's a lot of envy about how quickly the Chinese government's been able to move. But I think it's a little overblown.
Yeah.
It's true that they can move quickly, but they're also, I don't think people in America would be okay with the way that they do things.
Yeah. I mean, they certainly moved quickly at controlling their population problem by creating a one-child policy and issuing forced sterilizations and forced abortions. And the result of that was a rapidly aging population that doesn't have enough young people to fill in the roles. So, yeah, they moved quick and it got them screwed. That's what happens when you don't look before you leap, when you don't actually have a democratic process where people can, in an open and honest way, share their thoughts without fear of being purged and executed.
Well, and we've talked about that on our show a lot. We've talked about the future of government. And what's interesting is that, and you've mentioned Xi Jinping, he is trying to concentrate power on himself, giving him these rules. And for me, it feels like they're moving closer to the Russian model of communism than, probably past Chinese models or, they're nowhere close to Marxism. So that's one thing that we've talked about. And I kind of wanted to talk more about that, this concentrated power, this movement that's going on. You touched on it briefly. Tell us more of what you see that's going on in this, because we see what most Americans see, who are, that most people listen to our podcast, and probably most people in the Western world see. We see what China wants us to see. So tell us what you believe is really going on there. Is it becoming more dictatorial? What do you see is going on there with Xi Jinping?
Well, we would need to give a little bit of historical background on this, and I'll try to do this as succinctly as I can. But basically, the Tiananmen Square massacre happened. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the moment where it was like, okay, China is not going to reform.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
not easily.
Politically, there might be some economic change. But so anyways, essentially, the main guy who was in charge at the time, Deng Xiaoping, ended up purging the guy who was going to be his successor. So then there needed to be a new guy who was going to be Deng Xiaoping's successor. And so there was a bunch of different factions in the party. Some wanted to go back to the, ultra Maoist kind of days. Others still wanted economic reform. And so basically they made a compromise and put in the guy named Jiang Zemin. And he was in charge of Shanghai. That was kind of his base. And so he was put in charge, but he was not very popular with really anyone. Even Deng Xiaoping, he made a famous Southern tour. In 1993, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And so he even stopped at Shanghai, Jiang Zemin's power base, and was like, the pace of economic reform is not keeping up, and the central government is to blame. Clearly talking about Jiang Zemin. And that is basically around the same time Deng Xiaoping appointed Hu Jintao as Jiang Zemin's successor. Mm-hmm. So Jiang Zemin knew like the history of the Communist Party is going to be, he has to prevent himself from being purged, because there were attempts of coups against him by the president of China at the time. At that point, there was a difference between the head of the Communist Party and the president. That changed. And so essentially, Jiang Zemin found a very clever way to keep himself in power. So in 1999, basically a decade after students gathered in Tiananmen Square, there was the largest gathering since then, a group of Falun Gong practitioners who were appealing, I believe it was an arrest of some Falun Gong practitioners. And so for those who don't know, Falun Gong is a spiritual practice that kind of grew in the early 90s in China, developed a massive following. It's like a Qigong, Tai Chi kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And according to government's numbers, they were putting it at 60 to 100 million people. So at that time, more members than there were of the Communist Party.
Wow.
So a big group of them show up in Tiananmen Square, show up in Beijing at Zhongnanhai 10 years after the original Tiananmen protests. And what you see is you have Jiang Zemin, this is a threat to the Communist Party. They have infiltrated all levels of the party. So the only way for me to handle this is if I get to create this extra, what do you call it? Not extrajudicial.
Basically a
Gestapo.
Like a police force. Yeah. A police force that is not related to the actual police.
Yeah, it's answerable only to him or somebody appointed by him. It became known as the 610 office. And so what you see is Jiang using this persecution as a way to keep himself in power or appoint people he liked to handle the country. And so that's why Hu Jintao, when he came into power, he was actually kind of a lame duck leader. Oh, he did plenty of bad things. And so this was the environment that Xi Jinping essentially came into.
Xi Jinping's also a compromise candidate, I guess you could call him.
Essentially, yeah, because of a huge scandal that is too much to go into now. But look up the case of Bo Xilai. It's very interesting if people want to do their own research.
It involves like a murdered British guy. There's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on.
Wow.
Interesting.
But so essentially, she has a choice of amass power and purge his enemies, or be purged himself.
Interesting.
And so a lot of what you see under Xi Jinping's reign is that him trying to take control of the military. Jiang Zemin had appointed a lot of top generals in the military. And so that's why you see Xi Jinping creating all of these special working groups where he's always in charge. How he, in his anti-corruption campaign, he's purged a lot of the top generals Jiang Zemin had appointed. You see him purging other top members of the Communist Party that were tied to Jiang Zemin. Guys like Zhou Yangkang, who sort of ran the persecution after didn't he marry Jiang Zemin's niece? I seem to remember that.
Well, that's not as important as...
Yeah. It's basically Game of Thrones. There we go. Short answer.
Oh, there we go.
Game of Thrones.
Well, it is, I think, true that like when Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign, you have to look at it as it's an anti-corruption campaign, but it's, like Chris said, mostly a political purge.
Fortunately, they were all corrupt. So even though he's purging his political opponents, they also are corrupt.
So what I hear you saying is that she is the mother of dragons. So is that
I have a very bad image of my.
I mean, I don't think she is the hero though. Like,
okay, gotcha.
Yeah, that is a good point, because at the end of the day, the Communist Party is still in charge, and it is a system that generates this kind of struggle where it's always people trying to purge people that you're just trying to claw on top of the other jerk and knock him out of the way so you can be on top until somebody knocks you off.
You usually, to have gotten to the top level of the party, you've done something pretty shady in your past.
Yeah, there's a reason why they're all using black hair dye.
But
well, and let me piggyback this off then with our last question, because I think we're running out of time here, and I really want to ask you guys this, because I think this is kind of what all of our conversation has led up to, in the fact of, I mean, what do you guys see is the future necessarily of U.S. and Chinese relations in the next year, 5 years? I mean, if you want to go past that, I mean, obviously right now we have this trade war going on. Do you see it? I mean, do you see China capitulating? Do you see the United States capitulating? What is that future that you see of the relationship, and and touch base on that, and anything else that you guys want to talk about before the end of the show?
Trump doesn't know the meaning of the word capitulate.
He doesn't know how to spell it, that's for sure. That's
To be fair, I probably couldn't.
Yeah, I think that Trump's a little unpredictable, but I think what we'll see is a continuation, more or less, of the tariffs. Now, there could be some backing off. There could be like a kind of truce, or like, because Trump also is a person who does things with personal relationships. And, he's talked before about how much he enjoys Xi Jinping and the chocolate cake that they had together at Mar-a-Lago. And we're recording this before they've met at the G20. So we don't know what that meeting's going to bring. But I think the trajectory won't change, even if like there's some lessening of the tensions, which would be good for the stock markets and all that stuff. It won't be like the U.S. capitulates, and I don't think that structurally either the U.S. or Chinese systems can let there be like some kind of grand bargain, right? Where China is like, well, we promise to stop stealing intellectual property, and the U.S.
at the
is
end
like,
of the day, it's struggle.
Yeah, and the U.S. is like, oh, well, you can have those South China Sea islands. I don't see that happening. What about 5 years, Chris?
Well, I think is what you're seeing happening now, which is something I'm very encouraged about, since we've been doing China Uncensored since 2012, and it was kind of like crying in the dark for a long time.
Yeah, being the lone voice in the wilderness. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a dark forest. Now you see countries around the world waking up to the threat of the Chinese Communist Party, obviously in the U.S., obviously in countries like Australia, but then you also see countries like Malaysia, who recently elected a new prime minister who has called into question a lot of the very shady Chinese investments into the country. You see people questioning the Belt and Road and the debt traps that China is trying to use as a form of colonization. I like adding neo to words. That's appropriate for a
Futurist podcast.
Yeah.
I mean, special economic zones and stuff like that. I mean, that's exactly what we talk about on the shows.
Yeah, so, I saw that they're
the
increasing the investment in Africa, right? And I think a third of the $60 billion that they're investing is in credit lines. So in some ways, they're trying to redo what the World Bank and the IMF have been doing, which is bankrupt Africa to their own benefit. So yeah, I see the same things as well.
Such a cynical opinion about the World Bank.
Yeah, he's supposed to be the optimist.
No, I do think that like the Chinese Communist Party has been able to get away with this for like 20 some years because
it is surprising.
Because like we had this kind of like the way we treated them was like, oh, well, if we open up China economically, then naturally there will be like political liberalization, all this stuff that was exactly the opposite of what happened.
Well, also something happened around 2001, I think. Something happened that shifted the U.S.'s focus.
But I think now there is that, like Chris said, increasing realization. So I think that there's going to be a fundamentally different future. And I think it doesn't really matter anymore so much if Trump is in office. I think the Chinese Communist Party doesn't understand what's happening right now.
They don't understand democracy?
Well, I think they think that like maybe if a Democrat was elected, right, as the next U.S. president, maybe they just have to wait out Trump. And if a Democrat comes in, they'll treat China the way that the Democrats have in the past. There'll be another like Bill Clinton, but I don't think that's where this is going anymore.
Cat's out of the bag?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. All right.
Does it matter if it's a black cat or a white cat?
All right. Well, I'm going to give you guys some time. Please tell us more about China Uncensored, what you guys are doing with your podcast. Then we'll end the show with that.
Well, since 2012, we've been hosting China Uncensored. It's a satirical news show that talks about China news and politics.
A lot about how China is affecting other countries.
That's
in
the
the
big
world.
thing.
Yeah. Every time somebody tells us about an authoritarian regime, we kind of are like, I wonder what China's involvement is. And there always is a lot.
China is behind pretty much all the authoritarian regimes in the world right now. Yeah. So we have also recently started a podcast called China Unscripted, where we go into more depth on topics that we can't always get into on the show.
And we also talk to, other China watchers about different kinds of topics. Yeah.
And if anyone is interested, we also have a show called America Uncovered, which brings the same delightful sense of humor to American politics. And we try to be unbiased.
Very important.
So you can check all of this out. You can check out China Unscripted at ChinaUnscripted.com. You can see America Uncovered on YouTube. Obviously, China Uncensored on YouTube or the areas where we broadcast.
And China Unscripted also on iTunes.
Oh, yes, iTunes. Please go on iTunes and
check us out. Yeah.
Subscribe, review, stars, something.
We're new to podcasting.
Awesome. I can't recommend you guys enough. I mean, we've been following you for a couple of years. Thank you again so much.
I really appreciate it. It's great being on the show.